This playlist collects together and organizes the individual component modules, which together will comprise our first lecture on divine command theory. Specifically, we're going to be looking at Plato's Euthyphro and the fourth chapter of Rachel's Elements of Moral Philosophy, Does Morality Depend on Religion? The storyboard for this particular lecture goes as follows. We'll start by talking about two important foundational problems if you want to think about ethics. We'll introduce divine command theory as an attempt to answer those problems. We'll look at some of the advantages or motivations that might make divine command theory seem attractive to ethicists or just regular people. And then we'll consider the Euthyphro dilemma, the argument that Plato presents in his dialogue to the effect that divine command theory forces us into a situation where we have to choose between two theoretically undesirable alternatives. We'll consider the second horn of that dilemma, the second undesirable alternative first, look at some possible responses that people might make to Plato's argument, and then we'll turn our attention to the first horn of that dilemma and look at some of the implications that it has for moral theory. We'll end the lecture with a summary of what we've covered so far. Let's pivot then to the first topic of our lecture for today. Those two fundamental problems that I mentioned earlier. The first problem can be characterized as a meta-ethical problem, a problem about where the authority of moral norms comes from. We can think about that problem by asking questions like, what gives our moral norms authority? Or why ought our actions to be bound by moral norms? As we'll see throughout the term, various moral theories either explicitly defend or implicitly assume an answer to this meta-ethical problem. For example, a moral nihilist will respond to these questions by saying absolutely nothing. There is no source of moral authority. We do not need to bind our actions through moral norms. Someone like Immanuel Kant will say the source of moral authority is reason itself. Dictates of reason determine how we should act. Indeed, comparing the moral perspectives of Immanuel Kant and the moral nihilist illustrates how our answer to this fundamental meta-ethical problem can shape our moral perspective dramatically. This week, and particularly in this lecture, we're going to focus in on one proposed solution to this meta-ethical problem, what's called the divine command theory, or theological voluntarism. In our second lecture for the week, we'll use divine command theory as a vehicle through which to contemplate a second equally fundamental problem, what one might call an epistemological problem, a problem about how we can come to know moral truths or moral rules. You can think about this problem by asking questions like, how can we know the correct moral norms? Or where should we seek moral knowledge? I separate out these two problems into two different lectures because in my experience, discussions of divine command theory tend to conflate or run together these two problems when talking about divine command theory. And so I separate them out quite explicitly so that we can see their relationship to one another as well as their distinct nature. Even as I was discussing the topics of our two lectures, you might have been thinking to yourself, I really don't know what you're referring to here by this notion of a meta-ethical position or problem or an epistemological position or problem. So let's take a moment and review the meanings of those terms within philosophy. Now, epistemology is a branch of philosophy that's concerned primarily with understanding the nature, the sources, and the limits of knowledge, primarily human knowledge, but not necessarily so. What about meta-ethics? Well, meta-ethics really is a name for theories that are about ethics itself. So, for instance, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy defines meta-ethics as the attempt to understand the metaphysical, epistemological, semantic, and psychological presuppositions and commitments of moral thought, talk, and practice. To help clarify the notion of meta-ethics and compare it to ethics, let's consider what ethicists view as the three main areas of ethics. There's meta-ethics, there is normative ethics, and there is applied ethics. A meta-ethical position might be something like human life is sacred, a view about a principle that would guide ethical theories. Normative ethics would be an attempt to derive a norm, usually on the basis of that kind of principle. So murder is wrong. Applied ethics would look at a particular situation and try to come up with a way of applying that norm to achieve an ethical outcome. Say, how can we prevent people from murdering one another? With those clarifications in mind, let's remind ourselves now of the topics of our 2 lectures for this week. The first lecture concerns one set of answers to that meta-ethical problem, specifically moral authority on the divine command account issues from the will of the deity or deities. Divine command theory really specifies a view within Western Christian traditions, though it certainly could apply to other religions as well. In our second lecture, we'll turn our attention to the epistemological problem and the sorts of answers that emerge from within divine command theory to those epistemological questions. Specifically, the idea that moral knowledge issues from the deities, and so that to know what to do or how to conduct one's life, one ought to consult some kind of religious authority. For example, can one unproblematically learn one's moral norms from a religious text or religious teacher? Though we'll talk about this issue within the context of divine command theory. What we really want to look at is whether or not we can simply adopt a moral framework from some stated authority without ever contemplating, considering, challenging, or testing those dictates. With these preliminaries out of the way, in the next lecture module, we'll turn our attention to divine command theory and the meta-ethical problem.